What if I told you that some of the planet's rarest creatures, once declared functionally extinct, are secretly reclaiming their wild territories right under our noses? Today, we're tracking down 9 incredible animals that defied the ultimate death sentence, clawing their way back from population numbers so low that scientists genuinely believed the story was over. If you look away now, you'll miss the astonishing survival strategy of an apex predator that literally clawed its way back from just 24 individuals scattered across a frozen wilderness. And stick around, because number 1 on this list was considered a ghost species for over a century, written off in the scientific record, until a single sighting rewrote everything we thought we knew. This isn't just a list of animals. It's a look at what happens when humans stop making excuses and start making changes, and what nature does with even the smallest window of opportunity we give it. Let's kick things off at numbers 9 and 8, with 2 animals that could not look more different but share almost the exact same story of collapse and recovery. The Arabian oryx is a pale, almost ghostly antelope built for one of the harshest environments on the planet, the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. Its long, straight horns and thick white coat made it a prized hunting trophy for generations, and by the early 1970s, unregulated hunting with modern vehicles and rifles had wiped it out entirely in the wild. Every single wild Arabian oryx was gone. The only reason this species exists today is because a small number of individuals were already living in captivity, mostly in private collections and zoos, when the wild population collapsed. Conservationists recognized the emergency and launched what became known as Operation Oryx, carefully breeding those captive animals and reintroducing their descendants back into protected desert reserves starting in the late 1970s. It worked. Today, there are thousands of Arabian oryx roaming free again across Oman, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, making it one of the first animals ever to be upgraded from extinct in the wild back to a stable wild population. Right alongside it at number 8 is the southern white rhino, an animal so massive and so heavily armored that it's hard to imagine anything threatening it, and yet by the late 1800s, hunting had pushed this subspecies to the very edge of oblivion. At one point, fewer than 50 southern white rhinos were believed to exist, all confined to a single reserve in South Africa. That is a genetic bottleneck so severe that most conservationists at the time assumed extinction was simply a matter of time. But strict protection, dedicated anti-poaching enforcement, and a controversial but effective relocation program that moved rhinos into new protected territories across southern Africa changed the trajectory entirely. Today, the southern white rhino population has rebounded to more than 20,000 individuals, making it by far the most numerous rhino subspecies on Earth. It's a stunning reversal, though conservationists are quick to point out that poaching for rhino horn remains a constant, active threat, meaning this comeback still requires constant vigilance to protect. Moving to number 7, we head into the harsh, wind-scoured grasslands of Mongolia to meet Przewalski's horse, an animal that holds a title no other species on this list can claim. It is the last truly wild horse species left on Earth. Every other wild-looking horse you've ever seen, from Mustangs to Brumbies, descends from domesticated stock that escaped captivity. Przewalski's horse never went through that process. It is genetically distinct from domestic horses, with a stockier build, an upright mane, and a temperament far too independent for anyone to have ever truly tamed it. Habitat loss, competition with livestock, and hunting drove the species to complete extinction in the wild by the 1960s. For years, the only Przewalski's horses left on the planet existed in zoos, descended from a tiny handful of founding animals. Then came one of the most ambitious reintroduction efforts in conservation history. Starting in the 1990s, zoo-bred horses were transported back to the Mongolian steppe and released into reserves like Hustai National Park, where they had to relearn behaviors their ancestors had known instinctively but that captivity had softened. It worked far better than anyone expected. Today, there are well over 1,000 Przewalski's horses living wild across Mongolia and parts of China, their hooves once again striking frozen earth their ancestors abandoned generations ago. This is one of the only cases in history where a species went fully extinct in the wild and was successfully brought back from captive stock alone. Now let's climb into the sky and into the treetops for numbers 6 and 5. 2 recoveries that could not be more different in method but are equally staggering in scale. At number 6 is the California condor, North America's largest flying bird. with a wingspan stretching up to 9.5 feet. These are ancient scavengers, ecological cleanup crews that have existed in something close to their current form for tens of thousands of years. But lead poisoning from ammunition fragments and carcasses, habitat destruction, and illegal shooting devastated their population throughout the 20th century. By 1982, the situation had become so dire that only 22 California condors remained on the entire planet. 22. Faced with almost certain extinction, wildlife biologists made an extreme and controversial decision. They captured every single remaining wild condor and brought them into a captive breeding program, betting everything on the idea that a managed population could eventually be strong enough to return to the wild. It was a gamble that paid off. Chicks were carefully bred, raised with puppet-fed techniques to avoid human imprinting, and gradually released back into California, Arizona, Utah, and Baja California. Today, more than 300 California condors soar freely above the American West, with additional birds still living in breeding facilities as a safety net. Lead poisoning remains an ongoing challenge, but the population trend is undeniably moving in the right direction. At number 5, we shift from soaring cliffs to dense bamboo forests for the giant panda, arguably the most universally beloved animal on this entire list. For decades, the panda was the literal symbol of endangered species conservation, its black and white silhouette recognized around the world as shorthand for an animal on the brink. Habitat fragmentation from logging and agricultural expansion had splintered panda populations into small, isolated pockets across central China, cutting off the genetic exchange these animals needed to remain healthy long-term. China responded with one of the most extensive habitat restoration campaigns in conservation history, establishing dozens of dedicated panda reserves and, crucially, building bamboo corridors specifically designed to reconnect isolated populations so pandas could once again roam between habitats and breed more widely. Captive breeding programs also matured significantly, solving reproductive challenges that had plagued zoos for decades. The results were significant enough that in 2016, the International Union for Conservation of Nature officially downgraded the giant panda status from endangered to vulnerable, a change that conservation biologists rarely get to celebrate. It doesn't mean the panda is safe. Vulnerable still means at risk. But it represents one of the clearest examples of a government-backed, science-driven recovery plan actually working at scale. Now we're entering the top 4, and the stakes climb dramatically from here, because these next animals didn't just face habitat loss. They faced numbers so low that many scientists quietly assumed there was no coming back at all. At number 4 is the kakapo, and if you've never heard of this bird, prepare to be fascinated. The kakapo is a large, flightless, nocturnal parrot native to New Zealand, an evolutionary oddity shaped by millions of years of isolation on islands with no natural land predators. That total absence of predators meant the kakapo never developed the instincts or physical traits to defend itself when humans arrived with something New Zealand had never seen before: mammalian predators like rats, stoats, and cats. The results were catastrophic. Kakapo populations collapsed so severely that by the 1990s, fewer than 50 individuals remained on the entire planet. Conservationists recognized that leaving the birds in their original habitats was a losing battle against invasive predators that bred faster than intervention could control. So they made a radical decision. Every surviving kakapo was relocated to small, predator-free offshore islands, environments carefully cleared of invasive species and closely monitored around the clock. Every single kakapo on Earth today is known individually, tracked, and in many cases, named. This level of hands-on management sounds extreme, but it worked. The population has slowly climbed past 200 individuals, and during breeding seasons, their deep, resonant, booming mating calls sound so low frequency they can travel for kilometers through the forest, echo across these protected islands once again, a sound that conservationists feared might vanish from the planet entirely. Number 3 brings us to Europe for the Iberian lynx, and this comeback story is a masterclass in understanding that saving a predator sometimes means saving something else entirely first. 2 decades ago, the Iberian lynx was widely considered the most endangered cat species on Earth, with fewer than 100 individuals surviving in fragmented pockets of Spain and Portugal. The immediate cause of the collapse wasn't hunting or habitat loss alone, though both played a role. It was the near-total disappearance of the lynx's primary prey, the European wild rabbit, which had been decimated by disease outbreaks sweeping through the region. Without rabbits, lynx simply could not survive and reproduce at sustainable rates. Conservationists realized that no amount of direct protection for the lynx itself would matter if the prey base collapsed underneath them. So the recovery strategy shifted dramatically toward habitat restoration focused specifically on rebuilding rabbit populations, alongside captive breeding programs for the lynx and extensive habitat corridors connecting fragmented populations. It was a slow, patient, ecosystem-first approach rather than a quick fix. And it worked spectacularly. The Iberian lynx population has climbed from under 100 individuals to well over 1,000 today, making it one of the most successful wildcat recoveries ever documented, and proof that sometimes the fastest way to save a predator is to save what it eats first. At number 2, we finally arrive at the apex predator I promised you at the very beginning, the Amur leopard. This magnificent cat is adapted to survive in one of the most brutally cold environments any big cat calls home, the temperate forests of the Russian Far East near the border with China, where winter temperatures regularly plunge far below freezing. The Amur leopard's thick, pale coat and long legs are evolutionary adaptations specifically built for deep snow and frigid conditions, making it genetically and physically distinct from leopards found in Africa or elsewhere in Asia. But poaching for its stunning fur, combined with habitat loss from logging and agricultural expansion, pushed this subspecies to a population low that seems almost impossible to recover from. At its worst point, fewer than 30 Amur leopards remained in the wild, spread across a fragmented landscape with almost no room for genetic diversity or population growth. Conservation groups responded with intensive, coordinated anti-poaching patrols across the leopard's remaining range, working closely with Russian and Chinese wildlife authorities to establish protected corridors that allowed leopards to move safely between territories. Camera trap monitoring programs also expanded significantly, giving researchers real data on population trends for the first time. The results have been remarkable. Current estimates suggest the wild Amur leopard population has quadrupled from that devastating low point, though the total number remains critically small in absolute terms. This is a comeback still very much in progress, a species clinging to survival through relentless, ongoing human intervention, but one that proves even the rarest big cat on Earth can claw its way back from the edge when enough people refuse to give up. And now, finally, we arrive at number 1, the story I teased at the very beginning, the ghost species that fooled science for over a century. The Fernandina Island Galapagos tortoise is a subspecies unique to a single isolated volcanic island in the Galapagos archipelago, an island so remote and so volcanically active that scientific expeditions rarely ventured deep into its interior. In 1906, a research expedition collected a single specimen of this tortoise, and after that, decades passed without another confirmed sighting. Scientists eventually concluded the subspecies was almost certainly extinct, a casualty of volcanic eruptions, historical hunting by sailors and whalers who used tortoises as long-lasting food sources aboard ships, and the harsh, unforgiving terrain of the island itself. For over 100 years, the Fernandina Island tortoise existed only as a footnote in extinction records, a species science had quietly given up on. Then, in 2019, a joint expedition of researchers and park rangers trekking through Fernandina's remote, jagged volcanic landscape spotted something extraordinary. A lone female tortoise, alive, moving slowly through the vegetation exactly where no one expected to find anything at all. Genetic testing later confirmed what researchers had hardly dared to hope, that she was indeed a member of the subspecies believed extinct for over a century. Evidence since collected, including tracks and droppings found elsewhere on the island, strongly suggests she is not alone, that other individuals may still be surviving undetected in Fernandina's brutal, isolated terrain. This discovery stands as one of the most remarkable rediscoveries in the history of modern conservation science, a reminder that declaring a species extinct is sometimes less a scientific certainty and more an admission that we simply haven't looked hard enough, or in the right place, or at the right time. What ties all 9 of these stories together isn't luck. It's the fact that every single one of these species needed something different to survive, and conservationists had to figure out exactly what that was before recovery could even begin. For the Arabian oryx and the southern white rhino, it was strict protection paired with careful population management across protected reserves. For Przewalski's horse, it was an entire captive lineage patiently reintroduced to a landscape it had been erased from. For the California condor, it meant an extreme, all-or-nothing captive breeding gamble. For the giant panda, it meant rebuilding physical connections between fragmented habitats. For the kakapo, it meant total relocation to predator-free sanctuaries and individual, hands-on management of every surviving bird. For the Iberian lynx, it meant looking beyond the predator itself and rebuilding the prey species it depended on. For the Amur leopard, it meant relentless anti-poaching enforcement across international borders. And for the Fernandina Island tortoise, it simply meant someone finally looking in the right place at the right moment, after more than a century of assuming there was nothing left to find. None of these recoveries happened overnight, and none of them happened by accident. Every single one required years, sometimes decades, of sustained funding, scientific research, political cooperation, and, frankly, people willing to keep working on a problem that most of the world had already written off as hopeless. And that's really the deeper lesson buried inside all 9 of these stories. Extinction is often treated as an ending, a permanent full stop on a species' existence. But these animals prove that the line between extinct and merely critically endangered is sometimes thinner and more reversible than we assume, provided the right intervention happens before it's actually too late. Every one of these species still faces real, ongoing threats. Poaching hasn't disappeared. Habitat loss hasn't stopped. Climate change is reshaping the very ecosystems these animals fought so hard to reclaim. But the fact that we're even able to tell these 9 stories as comeback stories, rather than obituaries, says something powerful about what's possible when conservation science, government policy, and public awareness actually align toward a shared goal. One thing that rarely gets mentioned in these recovery stories is just how much modern technology has quietly reshaped the entire field of conservation science over the last 2 decades. GPS collars small enough to sit comfortably on a leopard's neck now transmit location data by satellite in near real time, letting researchers map territory boundaries and detect poaching incursions long before a body count would have revealed the problem. Camera traps triggered by motion and heat have replaced the guesswork that once defined population surveys, giving biologists thousands of individual sightings to work from instead of scattered, unreliable anecdotes from hikers and hunters. And in recent years, a technique called environmental DNA sampling has started changing the game entirely, allowing scientists to detect a species' presence simply by testing water or soil samples for microscopic traces of skin, saliva, or waste. No direct sighting required at all. It's entirely possible that some of the evidence supporting a handful of individuals from the Fernandina Island tortoise still surviving in that jagged volcanic terrain came from exactly this kind of indirect detection method, tools that simply didn't exist during the century when scientists first gave up hope. Genetics themselves have also become one of the most closely watched factors in every single one of these recoveries, and for good reason. When a population collapses to double digits, like the Amur leopard or the California condor once did, the surviving individuals carry only a fraction of the genetic diversity the species once had. Biologists call this a founder effect, and it creates a long tail of risk that lingers for generations even after raw population numbers start climbing again. Inbreeding depression, a phenomenon where closely related animals breeding together produce weaker offspring with higher rates of disease susceptibility and lower fertility, has quietly threatened to undo several of these recoveries from the inside. That's part of the reason conservation programs now rely heavily on studbooks, detailed genetic records tracking the ancestry of every individual in a managed population, so breeding pairs can be deliberately chosen to maximize genetic diversity rather than left to chance. It's a slow, unglamorous piece of the puzzle that almost never makes it into a headline, but without it, several of the species on this list might have bounced back in number only to collapse again a generation or 2 later from genetic problems nobody could see coming. It's also worth pausing to acknowledge that not every species facing this exact situation gets a happy ending, and understanding those failures helps explain why the 9 successes on this list matter so much. The baiji, a freshwater dolphin once found only in China's Yangtze River, was declared functionally extinct in 2006 after decades of habitat destruction, boat traffic, and pollution, and despite search efforts modeled directly on the same survey techniques that found the Fernandina tortoise, no confirmed sighting has ever followed. The Pyrenean ibex, a wild goat native to the mountains between Spain and France, actually did go extinct in the year 2000, and a cloning attempt shortly afterward produced a clone that survived only minutes after birth. A stark reminder that once a population crosses a certain threshold, even cutting-edge science can't always reverse the outcome. These are the stories that don't get triumphant documentary narration, and they exist as a sobering counterweight to everything we've covered today. Proof that recovery is never guaranteed, only ever possible under the right conditions, acted on soon enough. Funding is another piece of this puzzle that deserves real attention, because none of these recovery programs run on goodwill alone. Anti-poaching patrols across Amur leopard territory, predator-free island maintenance for the kakapo, and captive breeding facilities for the California condor all require sustained financial investment that has to come from somewhere. International treaties like the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species help restrict the legal trade that drives some of this poaching in the first place. But the day-to-day funding often comes from a patchwork of government budgets, international conservation nonprofits, and increasingly ecotourism revenue generated by travelers who want to see these animals in the wild with their own eyes. That last piece creates an interesting feedback loop. Tourists who pay to visit reserves protecting the southern white rhino or the Iberian lynx generate local income that gives surrounding communities a direct financial incentive to protect these animals rather than see them as competition for land or livestock. In several of these recovery zones, former poachers have even been hired as rangers, turning intimate knowledge of an animal's movement patterns into a tool for protection instead of exploitation. Local and indigenous communities living alongside these species have also played a far larger role in these recoveries than most outside coverage tends to credit. Mongolian herders near Hustai National Park adjusted grazing patterns to reduce competition with reintroduced Przewalski's horses. Communities near Fernandina and the wider Galapagos archipelago have supported strict access restrictions that limit human traffic into fragile tortoise habitat, even when that means turning away curious visitors. These aren't decisions made in a boardroom far away. They're daily trade-offs made by the people who live closest to these animals, and every one of the 9 recoveries on this list depended, at some level, on that local cooperation holding steady year after year. So where does that leave us? 9 species, 9 different rescue strategies, and one shared truth sitting underneath all of it. The gap between extinct and merely endangered was never really about the animals themselves. It was about whether enough people were willing to notice the collapse in time, commit the resources, and stay committed long enough to see the number climb back up. Some of these recoveries took less than a decade. Others are still unfolding right now, decades in and nowhere near finished. But every single one started the exact same way, with someone refusing to accept that the story was already over.